My husband handed me divorce papers that would leave me penniless. He smiled, certain his billions would crush me into silence. But I didn't panic. I'd spent 8 months building a case with my lawyer, gathering evidence of crimes he never imagined I'd discover. His arrogance had become his weakness. This was the moment he'd finally pay. I set my phone to record and slipped it into my purse as I sat down across from Brandon in the mahogany-paneled conference room. The air conditioning hummed softly, a stark contrast to the ice in his voice. "Sign here," he said, sliding the settlement documents across the polished table. The numbers were insulting, barely enough to cover 6 months of rent in a modest apartment. 38 years old, 12 years of marriage, and he'd calculated exactly how to leave me destitute while he kept his empire intact. What he didn't know was that Lara, my attorney, had been cataloging every fraudulent transaction, every hidden asset, every lie he'd told under oath. Before we continue with the story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. Oh, and drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. We love seeing that. Brandon leaned back in his leather chair, that familiar expression of satisfaction settling across his features, the same look he wore when crushing competitors in boardroom negotiations. Just 3 weeks ago, we'd been at a charity gala together. His arm around my waist as photographers captured us smiling. Now he was systematically destroying the life we'd built. "This is more than fair," Brandon said, his tone measured and cold. "You should be grateful. Most men in my position would offer far less." I kept my voice steady, letting every word register on the recording. "You're offering me less than 1% of our assets." "Not my assets," he corrected. "Everything's in my name. You were smart to marry me, but you forgot to protect yourself." His fingers drummed against the armrest. "Sign now, or my legal team will make this very ugly for you." I thought about the offshore accounts Lara had uncovered, the millions Brandon had been funneling away for years. I thought about his affair with Lily Givens, his executive assistant, and the hush money he'd been paying her. But I didn't mention any of it. Not yet. Everything had to unfold exactly as Lara and I had planned. "You have until 5 o'clock today," Brandon continued, checking his Rolex. "After that, the offer drops by half. I have a dinner meeting at 6, and I'd prefer to have this unpleasantness resolved." He stood, adjusting his cufflinks, confident that time pressure would force my hand. "Think carefully about your next move. You're nothing without my money, and we both know it. 8 months ago, I would have signed those papers through tears. 8 months ago, I still believed Brandon's cruelty was just stress from work, that our marriage could somehow be saved. That was before I found the second set of financial records hidden in his home office. Before I discovered he'd been systematically transferring our joint assets into shell companies I couldn't touch. Before I realized the divorce wasn't spontaneous, he'd been planning it for over 2 years. Tonight was meant to be his final victory, the moment he crushed me completely. But it was also his greatest miscalculation. "I need time to think," I said quietly, gathering my purse. Brandon's smile widened. 5 o'clock, he repeated, already turning toward the door. He left without another word, the conference room door closing with a soft click behind him. Through the window, I watched him stride toward his Mercedes, phone already pressed to his ear, probably calling Lily to celebrate. I counted to 30, then walked to the adjoining office, where Lara had been monitoring everything through the two-way glass. She stood beside her desk, holding a folder so thick it required rubber bands to stay closed. "Did you capture it all?" I asked. "Every word," Lara confirmed, her expression grim with satisfaction. "He just committed perjury on 3 counts. The statements he made contradict his sworn deposition from last month." She opened the folder, revealing bank statements, emails, and photographs that chronicled 2 years of systematic fraud. 12 years of marriage, and he thinks you're helpless, Lara said. "He has no idea you've been documenting everything since March. The forensic accountant's report alone is 200 pages. They're one pruz." "What about Lily?" I asked. "We have the recordings of him promising her a promotion in exchange for silence about the affair. Plus the wire transfers, $60,000 over 14 months. His lawyers will claim it's a gift, but combined with the voicemails." She smiled. "It's textbook coercion." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the city, the late afternoon sun disappearing behind gray masses. By tomorrow morning, Brandon would expect me to arrive at his office, broken and desperate, ready to sign anything he demanded. Judge Morrison reviews the emergency filing at 8 a.m. Lara continued, checking her watch. By 9:30, Brandon's assets will be frozen pending investigation. The federal investigators already have copies of everything: the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the shell corporations in Delaware, the falsified tax returns. Your friend Marcus at the SEC has been phenomenal. She pulled out another document, this one stamped with a court seal. And this is the restraining order. The moment he realizes what's happening, he's going to try to intimidate you. He won't get within 500 feet. I took a breath, feeling the weight of 8 months of secret preparation culminating in this single moment. Tomorrow, Brandon's carefully constructed empire would begin to crumble. But first, I needed to understand exactly how we'd gotten here, how a marriage that started with promise had devolved into calculated betrayal, and how I'd transformed from a woman he thought he controlled into the architect of his downfall. That first meeting with Lara happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 8 months before Brandon would slide those divorce papers across the conference table. I'd told him I was going to a yoga class. Instead, I drove 40 minutes outside the city to a law office tucked away in a suburban strip mall, somewhere Brandon would never think to look. Lara had come highly recommended by a former colleague who'd survived her own brutal divorce. When I walked into her modest office, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Tell me everything," she said, opening a leather notebook. "And I mean everything, the things that embarrass you, the things that scare you, the things you're not sure matter. Let me decide what's relevant." So I told her about the missing money, the 10,000 here, 15,000 there. The way Brandon's explanations never quite added up. How he'd grown colder over the past 2 years, more controlling about finances, more secretive about his business dealings. I told her about finding the earring pearl with a silver setting, definitely not mine, tucked beneath our bed frame 3 weeks earlier. "Have you confronted him about any of this?" Lara asked, her pen moving steadily across the page. "Once, he called me paranoid and said I was lucky to have married someone who understood money." Lara looked up, her expression sharp. "That's financial abuse. And I'm willing to bet there's more." She pulled out a legal pad. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to become a documentarian. Every bank statement, every credit card bill, every receipt you can access, make copies. Screenshot text messages. Keep a detailed log of conversations. If he says something threatening or demeaning, record the date, time, and exact words." The investigation began slowly. I started with the obvious things, our joint accounts, the household bills. But then I found Brandon's home office unlocked one Saturday while he was golfing. Inside his desk drawer, beneath folders of business contracts, I discovered a second ledger. Different company names, different account numbers, transactions that totaled millions. I photographed every page, my hands shaking so badly I had to retake several shots to ensure they were clear. The real breakthrough came in June. Brandon left his laptop open while he took a phone call in the next room. His email was displayed, and there at the top was a message from Lily Givens, his executive assistant, the woman I'd met twice at company events. "The reservation is confirmed for Friday. Same hotel. I'll wear the bracelet you gave me." I scrolled down. There were dozens of messages, going back 18 months. Some were explicitly romantic. Others discussed money wire transfers, gift purchases, a lease payment for an apartment I'd never heard of. I forwarded everything to a private email address I'd created just for this purpose, then cleared the browser history. "This is excellent work," Lara said when I showed her the emails during our next meeting. She'd brought in a forensic accountant named Marcus, a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses who studied the ledger photographs with intense focus. "These offshore accounts," he said, pointing to a series of transfers to a Cayman Islands bank. "This is textbook asset concealment. He's been preparing for a divorce by hiding marital property." "Can we prove it?" I asked. "With subpoenas, absolutely. And once we establish a pattern of deception, the court will scrutinize everything he claims." Marcus flipped through more pages. "The affair complicates things beautifully for our purposes. The money he's spending on her, the apartment, the gifts, the hush payments, that's marital funds being misused. We can argue dissipation of assets. Over the following months, the evidence folder grew thicker. Bank statements showing systematic transfers, emails between Brandon and his accountant discussing how to restructure assets, photos of Brandon and Lily at restaurants, taken by a private investigator Laura hired after I approved the expense, phone records showing hundreds of calls between them, many late at night. But it wasn't just about the affair or the money. As I dug deeper into Brandon's business dealings, I uncovered something darker: false tax returns, fabricated income statements to investors, wire fraud. What had started as a divorce case was morphing into something that could attract federal attention. "Are you prepared for how ugly this will get?" Laura asked me during one of our final planning sessions, just 2 weeks before Brandon would blindside me with his settlement offer. "When we present this evidence, his lawyers will come after you. They'll try to discredit you, claim you're vindictive or mentally unstable. They'll make you out to be a gold digger who's fabricating evidence." I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, uncertain, financially dependent, afraid to challenge Brandon's authority. Then I thought about the woman I'd become. Someone who'd spent 8 months meticulously building an unshakable case, who'd learned to read financial statements and understood the legal definition of fraud. "Let them try," I said. Now, standing in Lara's office with that 200-page forensic report in my hands, I felt the full weight of what we'd built together. Tomorrow morning, Judge Morrison would review our emergency filing. By noon, Brandon's world would begin to collapse. Every lie he'd told, every dollar he'd hidden, every promise he'd broken, it would all come to light. I slipped the recording device from my purse and set it on Lara's desk alongside the folder of evidence. These weren't just documents anymore. They were weapons, and I was finally ready to use them. Brandon returned to the conference room at 4:45, 15 minutes before his self-imposed deadline. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who believed the game was already won. His designer suit was perfectly pressed, his expression relaxed. He set his phone face down on the table and looked at me with something resembling pity. "Have you made your decision?" he asked, settling into the leather chair across from me. I glanced at the unsigned settlement papers, still sitting where he'd left them hours earlier. "I have some questions first." His jaw tightened slightly. "We covered everything this morning. There's nothing left to discuss." "Actually," Laura said, stepping into the conference room from the adjoining office where she'd been waiting, "there's quite a bit to discuss." She carried a file folder, deceptively thin, and placed it carefully on the table between us. Brandon's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "Laura Kensington. I'm representing your wife in these proceedings." She sat down beside me, her movements deliberate and controlled. "And before any papers get signed, we need to address some significant discrepancies in your financial disclosure." "Discrepancies?" Brandon's laugh was sharp, dismissive. "I've provided everything required by law. My accountant prepared those documents weeks ago." "Yes, I've reviewed them," Laura said evenly. She opened the folder and withdrew a single photograph. Brandon and Lily Givens, sitting close together at a restaurant, his hand on her arm. "What you failed to disclose is your ongoing affair with Lily Givens, your executive assistant, an affair you've been funding with marital assets for the past 18 months. The color drained from Brandon's face. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, he said nothing. The confident mask he'd worn so effortlessly began to crack. "You can't possibly." "We have emails," Laura continued, her voice calm and measured. "Text messages, credit card receipts, wire transfers totaling $60,000 to Miss Givens' personal account. The lease for the apartment on West 42nd Street, signed in your name." She laid out each piece of evidence methodically, like a dealer distributing cards. "In case you're wondering, dissipation of marital assets to fund an extramarital affair is taken very seriously by the courts." Brandon's gaze snapped to me. "You've been spying on me?" "I've been documenting the truth," I said quietly, "something you stopped doing a long time ago." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "This is harassment. I'll have your license revoked," he said to Laura, jabbing his finger in her direction. You can't just manufacture evidence and expect. Nothing has been manufactured, Lara interrupted. She withdrew another document. This one, multiple pages, stapled together. This is a forensic accounting report prepared by Marcus Rivera, a certified fraud examiner. It details systematic transfers from your business accounts to offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands. Over the past 24 months, you've moved approximately $12 million into shell corporations and foreign accounts. Brandon's hand moved to the edge of the table as if to steady himself. That's business restructuring. Perfectly legal. It would be, if you'd disclosed it to your wife or reported it accurately on your tax returns. Lara's expression remained neutral, but her words landed like hammer blows. What you've done constitutes both civil fraud and criminal tax evasion. The IRS tends to take a dim view of offshore accounts used to conceal income. You're bluffing. But his voice had lost its certainty. He reached for his phone, fingers trembling slightly. Lara placed another document on the table. This is a subpoena for your complete financial records from the past 5 years, including all international transactions. It was approved by Judge Morrison this afternoon. By Monday morning, we'll have access to every account, every transfer, every shell company you thought you'd hidden. I watched Brandon's face as the reality settled over him. This wasn't supposed to happen. In his mind, I was still the compliant wife who'd never questioned his authority, who'd signed whatever papers he put in front of her, the woman who could be intimidated with a cruel settlement and abandoned without consequence. He turned to me, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. You don't understand what you're doing. If you pursue this, you'll destroy everything. My business, my reputation. Your business built on embezzlement? I asked. Your reputation as someone who hides assets from his wife and commits tax fraud? The federal investigators already have copies of everything, Lara added. She withdrew one final document, official letterhead with government seals. Securities fraud, wire fraud, false statements to investors. The list is extensive. She slid it across the table toward Brandon. Your lawyers will receive their copies tomorrow morning, along with notice that all your assets have been frozen pending investigation. Brandon grabbed the document, his eyes scanning the text with increasing horror. His hand shook as he read. The confident billionaire who'd walked into this room expecting total victory now looked like a man watching his empire crumble in real time. You can't do this, he whispered. I'll fight this. I'll bury you in legal fees. With what funds? Lara asked. By 9 a.m. tomorrow, you won't have access to any accounts. Your credit cards will be frozen. Your assets immobilized. She stood, gathering the evidence back into her folder. I suggest you contact a criminal defense attorney. You're going to need one. Brandon looked at me, and I saw the moment he finally understood. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a divorce settlement he could manipulate with threats and money. This was justice, methodically constructed over 8 months of patient preparation, now falling on him like an avalanche. How long? He asked hoarsely. How long have you known? Long enough, I said. He stumbled backward toward the door, the document still clutched in his hand. The man who'd once controlled every aspect of our life together now couldn't even control his own exit. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a hollow click. Lara turned to me. He'll try to move money tonight. Contact people. But we've already alerted the banks and the federal authorities. Every transaction will be monitored. I nodded, my heart still pounding. Brandon had built his empire on deception, convinced that power and wealth made him untouchable. He'd never considered that the woman he'd underestimated for 12 years might be the one to expose it all. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, wood paneling, fluorescent lights, and rows of benches that made it feel more like a classroom than the arena where Brandon's empire would crumble. I sat beside Lara at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded calmly in my lap, while Brandon and his 3 attorneys occupied the defense table across the aisle. He wore his most expensive suit, the charcoal Tom Ford he saved for major investor meetings, and his expression was carefully composed, controlled, confident, untouchable. Judge Morrison entered, and we all rose. She was a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for having zero tolerance for games. Be seated, she said, settling behind the bench. We're here for the emergency motion regarding asset freezing and financial disclosure in the matter of, she glanced at her papers, the dissolution of marriage. Counsel, you may proceed. Lara stood, moving to the center of the courtroom with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Your Honor, my client is seeking immediate asset protection based on evidence of systematic fraud, asset concealment, and marital dissipation, spanning 24 months. Brandon's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Patrick Donnelly, rose from his seat. Your Honor, these allegations are completely fabricated. My client has provided full financial disclosure as required. With respect, Lara interrupted smoothly. The disclosure provided was materially false. She approached the bench with a bound document. This is a forensic accounting report prepared by Marcus Rivera, a certified fraud examiner. It documents $12 million in undisclosed offshore accounts, systematic underreporting of income, and the fraudulent concealment of assets. Judge Morrison accepted the document, flipping through the first few pages. Her expression remained neutral, but I saw her eyebrows raise slightly. These are serious allegations. Supported by extensive documentation, Lara confirmed. She gestured to the cart beside our table, stacked with evidence boxes, bank statements, wire transfer records, emails between the defendant and his accountant, explicitly discussing asset concealment. We've used the net worth method to demonstrate that the defendant's increase in assets far exceeds his reported income. I watched Brandon's jaw tighten. His attorney leaned over to whisper something, but Brandon shook his head curtly. Your Honor, if I may, Lara continued. She pulled up a presentation on the courtroom's display screen, charts and graphs, showing financial flows over time. In January 2 years ago, the defendant reported a net worth of $8 million. Today, his disclosed net worth is $9 million. However, our analysis shows he actually acquired assets worth over $21 million during this period, including property purchases, investment accounts, and offshore holdings he failed to disclose. The numbers appeared on screen, color-coded and damning. Red lines showed Brandon's reported income. Blue lines showed his actual spending and asset acquisition. The gap between them was enormous. Where does counsel suggest this money came from? Judge Morrison asked. From the defendant's business ventures, which he systematically bled through embezzlement and fraudulent billing practices, Lara said. We have internal company documents showing false invoices, inflated expenses, and transfers to shell corporations the defendant controls. Brandon stood abruptly. This is absurd. Mr. Jackson, sit down, Judge Morrison said sharply. You'll have your opportunity to respond. He remained standing for one defiant moment before Donnelly pulled him back into his seat. I'd never seen Brandon forced to back down before. Something shifted in my chest, not quite satisfaction, but a recognition that the power dynamic had fundamentally changed. Donnelly stood, straightening his tie. Your Honor, my client is a successful businessman with complex financial holdings. What opposing counsel is presenting as fraud is actually routine corporate restructuring. The offshore accounts were established for legitimate tax planning purposes. Then why weren't they disclosed in the financial statement as required? Lara asked. Why did the defendant sign a sworn affidavit 3 weeks ago stating his only accounts were the ones listed accounts that represented less than half his actual holdings? My client made an error in good faith. An error? Lara's voice sharpened. Your Honor, we also have evidence that the defendant has been funding an extramarital affair with marital assets. $60,000 in direct transfers to his executive assistant, plus an apartment lease, luxury gifts, and travel expenses. She produced another set of documents. This represents dissipation of marital assets for personal gratification money that should have been available for the marital estate. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Morrison raised her hand for silence. Do you have documentation of these transfers? Extensive documentation, Your Honor. Bank records, credit card statements, hotel receipts. We can trace every dollar. Lara projected more images onto the screen, bank statements with highlighted transfers, emails between Brandon and Lily discussing the apartment. I glanced at Brandon. His face had gone pale, and he was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had turned white. The mask of control he'd worn so confidently was cracking. piece by piece. Your Honor, Donnelly tried again, his voice strained. Even if some of these allegations prove accurate, that doesn't justify freezing all of my client's assets. He has business obligations, employees who depend on. He has criminal exposure, Laura countered. False tax returns filed with the IRS. Wire fraud. Securities fraud in statements to investors. The moment this hearing concludes, copies of all evidence will be forwarded to federal prosecutors. She let that sink in. Without asset freezing, there's substantial risk the defendant will dissipate, conceal, or transfer remaining assets beyond the court's reach. Judge Morrison looked directly at Brandon. Mr. Jackson, did you disclose all your financial holdings when you submitted your financial statement last month? Brandon stood slowly. I could see him calculating, trying to find an angle that would salvage this. Your Honor, my financial affairs are complex. There may have been some accounts that were inadvertently. Yes or no, Mr. Jackson? A long pause. The courtroom was utterly silent. Some accounts were not included, he finally admitted, the words seemingly forced from him. Why not? Another pause. Then, on advice of counsel, he shot a look at Donnelly, who stiffened. Judge Morrison's expression hardened. I'm granting the emergency motion for immediate asset freezing, pending a full accounting. All accounts, domestic and international, are to be frozen within 24 hours. The defendant will provide complete financial disclosure within 14 days, and I'm appointing a forensic examiner to verify accuracy. She looked at Brandon over her reading glasses. Mr. Jackson, if I discover you've concealed or transferred any additional assets, you'll face contempt charges. Do you understand? Brandon nodded once, his face ashen. As Judge Morrison adjourned the hearing, I felt the weight of 8 months of preparation crystallizing into this single moment. Brandon had walked into this courtroom believing his wealth and attorneys would protect him, that his web of lies was too complex to untangle. Instead, every deception had been methodically exposed, every hidden account brought into the light. He wouldn't meet my eyes as we left the courtroom. The man who'd tried to leave me penniless now faced losing everything himself. 3 days after Judge Morrison froze Brandon's assets, we returned to court for the full evidentiary hearing. The courtroom was packed this time not just with lawyers and court staff, but with journalists who'd caught wind of the case. A billionaire businessman accused of fraud and embezzlement made for compelling headlines, and the media benches were filled with reporters clutching notebooks and tablets. Brandon sat at the defense table flanked by his legal team, but something fundamental had changed. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a rigid tension that showed in every line of his body. He'd lost weight in just 3 days, his suit hanging slightly looser on his frame. His eyes kept darting to the gallery, where I knew he was tracking which journalists were present, calculating how much damage this would do to his reputation. Judge Morrison took her seat. We're here to examine the evidence regarding financial misconduct and asset concealment. Counsel for the plaintiff, you may proceed. Lara rose, composed as ever. Your Honor, we're presenting additional evidence today that demonstrates the defendant's systematic deception extends beyond what was initially disclosed. She approached the bench with a thick folder. Specifically, we've uncovered proof of hush money payments and undisclosed real estate holdings. Brandon's attorney, Donnelly, shot to his feet. Objection. This is turning into a fishing expedition. Mr. Donnelly, I'll hear the evidence before making any determinations, Judge Morrison said sharply. Proceed, Miss Kensington. Lara projected documents onto the courtroom screen, bank transfers highlighted in yellow, each one labeled with a date and amount. Over 18 months, the defendant made regular payments to Lily Givens totaling $60,000. These payments were categorized in his records as consulting fees to obscure their true nature. She pulled up emails. However, text messages and emails between the defendant and Miss Givens make clear these payments were hush money to keep their affair secret. One message appeared on screen, Brandon's words stark against the white background. The payment covers this month, and your silence. Don't make me regret being generous. A collective murmur swept through the gallery. I saw reporters leaning forward, typing rapidly on their devices. Brandon's face had gone ashen, His jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching. Furthermore, Lara continued, moving to the next slide. We've discovered 3 residential properties the defendant failed to disclose in his financial statement. Images appeared: a lakefront cabin, a downtown condo, a beachfront property. Total value, approximately $4 million. All purchased during the marriage using marital funds. All held in the names of Shell, LLCs, the defendant controls. That's impossible, Brandon hissed, loud enough that several people turned to look. Donnelly grabbed his arm, whispering urgently. But Brandon shook him off. He stood, his voice rising. Those properties are business investments, completely legitimate. Mr. Jackson, sit down, Judge Morrison commanded. One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt. Brandon remained standing for a defiant moment, his eyes wild with something between rage and panic. Then, slowly, he sank back into his chair. I watched him crumble in real time, the carefully constructed image of control dissolving like paper in water. Lara remained calm, professional. The properties were purchased with funds traced directly from the defendant's business accounts, accounts that included marital assets. She displayed more documents, showing the money trail. He then placed them in LLCs with generic names to hide his ownership. Land registry searches revealed the truth. Judge Morrison studied the evidence, her expression growing increasingly severe. Mr. Donnelly, did your client disclose these properties in his financial statement? Donnelly stood reluctantly. Your Honor, there may have been some confusion about which assets required. Yes or no, counsel? A painful pause. No, Your Honor. And the payments to Miss Givens? Those were not disclosed as such. Judge Morrison set down her pen with deliberate force. So we have undisclosed real estate worth $4 million, concealed payments totaling $60,000, and offshore accounts worth $12 million. All omitted from sworn financial disclosures. She looked at Brandon with barely concealed contempt. Mr. Jackson, you signed those disclosures under oath. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? Brandon opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in our 12 years together, I saw him completely speechless. No smooth explanation. No calculated response. No way to manipulate his way out. Your Honor, Lara said, given the extensive pattern of deception, we're requesting that the court impose sanctions and refer this matter to the appropriate authorities for criminal investigation. The gallery erupted in whispered conversations. Cameras no longer allowed in federal courtrooms but present in the hallway would be capturing every person who exited, every reaction, every detail. Judge Morrison raised her hand for silence. I'm calling a 30-minute recess. When we return, I want to hear from the defendant directly about why I shouldn't hold him in contempt and recommend criminal charges. She stood. All rise. As the judge left, the courtroom burst into motion. Reporters rushed for the exit, clearly eager to file their stories. Brandon sat motionless at his table, staring at nothing, while his attorneys huddled around him in urgent conversation. I remained seated, feeling the weight of this moment settle over me. 3 days ago, I'd been the woman Brandon thought he could discard without consequence. The woman he'd underestimated for 12 years, believing his wealth and power made him untouchable. Now I watched him realize that everything he'd built, his reputation, his empire, his carefully curated image, was collapsing around him. Not through violence or confrontation, but through documentation, evidence, and the methodical exposure of truth. Lara leaned close to me. The media coverage will be extensive, she said quietly. Are you prepared for that? I nodded. I'd stopped being the woman who feared Brandon's anger months ago. Somewhere between discovering his betrayal and building this case, I'd transformed into someone stronger. Someone who refused to be silenced or controlled. When court reconvened in 30 minutes, Brandon would face Judge Morrison's judgment. But the real verdict had already been delivered the moment his lies were exposed to the light. He'd wanted to leave me penniless and powerless. Instead, he'd created the woman who would bring his entire world crashing down. I was having coffee in my temporary apartment, a modest 2-bedroom I'd rented after leaving our house when Lara called at 7:30 in the morning. Turn on the news, she said without preamble. Any channel. I grabbed the remote, and there it was. Aerial footage of Brandon's mansion, the sprawling estate in the hills that had been our home for 8 years. Black SUVs filled the circular driveway, their doors emblazoned with federal agency seals. Men and women in windbreakers moved purposefully across the manicured lawn, carrying boxes and equipment. Federal agents executed search warrants at dawn. The news anchor announced, Brandon Jackson, the hedge fund billionaire, is being arrested on charges of embezzlement, wire fraud, securities fraud, and tax evasion. The investigation, which began months ago, culminated in today's dramatic action. The camera zoomed in on the front entrance. Brandon emerged, flanked by 2 agents, his hands cuffed in front of him. He wore sweatpants and a t-shirt. I'd never seen him in anything but tailored clothing. His hair was uncombed, his face pale and drawn. Gone was every trace of the polished businessman who'd commanded boardrooms and intimidated opponents with a single look. Mr. Jackson is accused of systematically defrauding investors and concealing assets worth over $20 million in offshore accounts. The anchor continued. If convicted on all charges, he faces up to 30 years in federal prison. I watched as the agents guided Brandon into the back of a waiting vehicle. For just a moment, he looked directly at the cameras, not with defiance or anger, but with something closer to bewilderment, as if he still couldn't comprehend how this had happened to him. The SEC has frozen all of Mr. Jackson's assets pending the outcome of the investigation, the reporter said. His business partners are cooperating with authorities, and several have already provided testimony about fraudulent financial practices. My phone buzzed with incoming messages. Friends I hadn't heard from in months, former colleagues, even Brandon's own sister asking if I was okay. The story was everywhere, trending on social media, breaking news alerts, front-page headlines. A billionaire's fall from grace always captured public attention. But the details of Brandon's crimes made it particularly compelling. "How are you holding up?" Laura asked when I called her back. "I'm processing." I set down my coffee cup, my hands steadier than I expected. Part of me thought he'd find a way out, that his lawyers would negotiate something, that his money would protect him somehow. "Not this time," Laura said. "The U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't pursue cases like this unless they have overwhelming evidence. The offshore accounts alone constitute multiple felonies. Add in the securities fraud, the false statements to investors, the tax evasion, they've built an airtight case." I turned up the volume as another news segment began. They were showing photos of Brandon from better days, accepting awards, speaking at conferences, posing with politicians and celebrities. The contrast with the footage of his arrest was stark. Authorities have seized multiple properties, including a lakefront cabin, a downtown condo, and luxury vehicles. The reporter said, "The total value of seized assets exceeds $15 million. My thoughts drifted back to that first meeting with Lara 8 months ago, when I'd walked into her office terrified and uncertain. I'd been a woman who'd lost her sense of self, who'd allowed Brandon's control to define her entire existence. I'd believed his narrative that I was lucky to have married him, that I'd be nothing without his money, that questioning him was paranoia rather than self-preservation. But somewhere in the process of documenting his lies, photographing his ledgers, recording his threats, I'd transformed. Not all at once, but gradually, like steel being tempered in fire. Each piece of evidence I gathered made me stronger. Each meeting with Lara reinforced that I wasn't crazy or vindictive. I was protecting myself from a man who'd systematically betrayed every promise he'd made. The defendant's wife filed for divorce 3 months ago, another reporter was saying. Court documents reveal she provided crucial evidence to federal investigators, including financial records and communications that exposed the full scope of the alleged fraud. My name appeared on screen. My photo, an old one from a charity event. Brandon and me standing together, both smiling. It felt like looking at a stranger. Sources say Mrs. Jackson became suspicious after discovering discrepancies in their joint accounts. The reporter continued. Her attorney secured a forensic audit that uncovered offshore accounts, shell corporations, and systematic asset concealment. I thought about Brandon's face when Lara had first revealed we knew about the offshore accounts. The shock, then the calculation as he'd tried to find an angle. A way to spin the narrative in his favor. Even then, he hadn't truly believed he'd face consequences. Men like Brandon, wealthy, powerful, surrounded by enablers, rarely did. But the evidence had been overwhelming. The forensic trail, too clear. And now the man who'd tried to leave me penniless was being led away in handcuffs, his empire collapsing so thoroughly there was nothing left to salvage. My phone rang again. My lawyer. "The prosecutor wants to meet with you," Lara said. "They're preparing for trial and need to walk through your testimony. Are you ready for that?" I watched the news footage loop again. Brandon being escorted from our home, the mansion I'd decorated and maintained, the life I'd thought was permanent. The woman who'd lived there would have been terrified by this moment. She would have worried about Brandon's reaction, about what people would think, about whether she was being vindictive or cruel. But I wasn't that woman anymore. "I'm ready," I said. Outside my apartment window, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting light across the city. Somewhere across town, Brandon was being processed into federal custody, fingerprinted and photographed, his freedom stripped away by the weight of his own lies. He'd believed power protected him, that wealth made him untouchable, that I was too weak, too dependent, too broken to fight back. He'd been wrong on every count. And now, as the news anchors dissected his crimes and legal experts debated his potential sentence, the truth was finally visible for everyone to see. The billionaire who'd tried to destroy his wife had instead destroyed himself. The empire he'd built on fraud had become his prison. And the woman he'd underestimated had become the architect of his downfall. 6 weeks after Brandon's arrest, Lara called me to her office. The news cycle had been relentless. Every day brought new revelations about Brandon's crimes, new investors coming forward with stories of deception, new evidence of the systematic fraud that had sustained his empire. His name had become synonymous with corporate scandal, discussed in business schools as a cautionary tale and dissected on financial news channels. "We've won," Lara said simply, sliding a document across her desk. "The revised settlement agreement, signed by Brandon's attorneys this morning." I picked up the papers, scanning the numbers that had once seemed impossible. A 50% split of all marital assets, including full disclosure of the previously hidden accounts. The lakefront cabin, the downtown condo, both now mine to sell or keep. Full restitution for the funds Brandon had dissipated on his affair. And a clause ensuring I wouldn't be held liable for any of his criminal debts or penalties. "His legal team knows the criminal trial is coming," Lara explained. "They wanted to resolve the civil matters before things get worse. Brandon's facing 30 years minimum, if convicted on all counts. They're trying to salvage whatever they can." I set down the papers, feeling the weight of 8 months of preparation crystallizing into this single moment. What about his investors? They're suing separately. A class action for securities fraud. Brandon's assets are being liquidated to cover the judgments, what's left after legal fees and penalties. Lara pulled up a news article on her tablet. His hedge fund formally dissolved last week. Every employee laid off. The office space vacant. Its complete financial collapse. The article showed Brandon's corporate headquarters, the sleek glass building that had been the symbol of his success. A "for lease" sign hung in the lobby window. Photos accompanying the story showed investors picketing outside, holding signs demanding accountability. One banner read, "Jackson stole our retirement. Public opinion has been overwhelmingly in your favor," Lara continued, scrolling through social media reactions. The narrative of a billionaire using his wealth to crush his wife, then having her turn the tables. It's resonated with people. You're being portrayed as the hero in this story. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Hero seemed too simple a word for what had happened. I hadn't set out to destroy Brandon or become a symbol of justice. I'd simply refused to be destroyed myself. "The prosecutors want you to testify at his trial," Lara said. "You don't have to. The documentary evidence speaks for itself. But they think a jury seeing you, hearing directly about his attempts to leave you penniless while hiding millions, would be powerful." I thought about standing in another courtroom, facing Brandon across the divide. Part of me wanted to be done with all of this, to sign the settlement, take my half of what remained, and disappear into a quieter life. But another part recognized that testimony wasn't just about Brandon's prosecution. It was about making visible what he'd tried to keep hidden: the systematic abuse of power, the financial manipulation, the belief that wealth placed him beyond accountability. "I'll testify," I said. Lara nodded, unsurprised. "The trial starts in 3 months. By then, every detail of Brandon's crimes will be public knowledge. His reputation is already destroyed. This will just make it official." I walked to the window of Lara's office, looking out at the city below. Somewhere in that sprawl, Brandon sat in a federal detention center, awaiting trial. The mansion had been seized to cover debts. The Mercedes sold at auction. The designer suits packed away or donated. Everything he'd built, everything he'd used to define himself, had been systematically dismantled. And yet, standing there, I felt no triumph, no vindictive satisfaction, just a quiet recognition that justice, real justice, wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring balance, about ensuring that power couldn't shield someone from the consequences of their choices. "How far you've come," Lara said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. The woman who walked into my office 8 months ago was terrified, uncertain, convinced she was powerless. I remembered that first meeting, the way my hands had shaken as I'd told Lara about the missing money, the affair, the growing sense that my marriage was built on lies. I'd been so afraid of what Brandon would do if he discovered I was investigating him, afraid of losing everything, of being left with nothing. I'd lost the marriage anyway, but in the process, I'd gained something far more valuable. Proof that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. That careful preparation and documented truth could defeat even the most powerful opponent. That refusing to be silenced mattered. "What will you do now?" Lara asked. "Live," I said simply, "on my own terms." 2 days later, I stood outside the courthouse after signing the final settlement papers. Media cameras had gathered, they always did now, but I'd grown accustomed to their presence. Lara had prepared a brief statement, which I read calmly into the microphones. "Justice isn't always loud or dramatic," I said. "Sometimes it's quiet and methodical. It's documentation and evidence. It's refusing to accept a narrative that makes you powerless. My hope is that anyone facing similar circumstances knows that truth, carefully preserved, can prevail." The reporters shouted questions, but I didn't answer them. I'd said what needed saying. As I walked down the courthouse steps toward the car waiting at the curb, I passed a group of women holding signs. "Thank you for speaking up. Your courage inspired us. We believe survivors." One of them, a woman about my age, caught my eye. "I'm gathering evidence too," she said quietly. "Because of you, I know it's possible." I nodded to her, feeling the full weight of what this had become. My story wasn't just about Brandon anymore. It was about every person who'd been told they were powerless against wealth or influence or control. It was proof that systems could work, that truth could matter, that justice, real, substantive justice, was achievable. The car pulled away from the courthouse, and I watched the building recede in the side mirror. Behind me, 8 months of preparation, courtroom battles, media scrutiny, and the systematic exposure of Brandon's crimes. Ahead, a life entirely my own, shaped by choices I alone would make. Brandon had tried to write my ending. Instead, I'd written his, and mine was just beginning. 3 months after the settlement was finalized, I sat in a financial advisor's office, reviewing investment strategies for the first time in my adult life. During my marriage, Brandon had controlled every financial decision, dismissing my questions as unnecessary and my input as irrelevant. Now, the money was mine alone, and the responsibility felt both daunting and liberating. "The key is diversification," my advisor explained, spreading out portfolio projections across the conference table. "We'll keep 6 months of expenses liquid for security, then invest the remainder in a balanced portfolio: stocks, bonds, some real estate investment trusts. The goal is sustainable growth without excessive risk." I studied the charts, asking questions I'd never been allowed to ask before. How much exposure to international markets? What were the tax implications of different investment vehicles? What contingencies existed if markets declined? "You're asking all the right questions," the advisor said with approval. "Financial literacy is the foundation of long-term security." I left that meeting with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The settlement wasn't just money, it was freedom. The ability to make decisions, to shape my own future, to never again be dependent on someone who could weaponize that dependence against me. The lakefront cabin became my sanctuary. I kept it, spending weekends there working on a manuscript. I'd started a book about financial abuse and the legal strategies that had saved me. Several publishers had already expressed interest. Apparently, there was an appetite for stories about women who fought back and won. The downtown condo I sold, using the proceeds to establish a fund for women going through high-conflict divorces who couldn't afford forensic accounting services. Lara helped me structure it, ensuring the money would be used effectively. Within 2 months, we'd helped 5 women uncover hidden assets their spouses had concealed. I was rebuilding not just my financial life but my sense of self. I took classes in financial planning, joined a women's investment group, volunteered at a legal aid clinic. The woman who'd once been afraid to check a bank statement without permission was now teaching others how to protect themselves. 4 months into my new life, Lara called. "Brandon wants to see you," she said. His attorney reached out. "He's asking for a meeting before his trial starts next week." My first instinct was to refuse. What could he possibly say that mattered now? But curiosity and perhaps a need for closure made me agree. The meeting took place at the Federal Detention Center, in a sterile visiting room with guards stationed at the door. Brandon entered wearing an orange jumpsuit, his face gaunt and drawn. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms with effortless confidence now shuffled to the table with the defeated posture of someone who'd lost everything. We sat across from each other, separated by a table that felt like a chasm. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. His voice lacked all its former authority. I said nothing, waiting. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued, his hands clasped on the table. "I know what I did to you, to my investors, to everyone who trusted me. I convinced myself the rules didn't apply to me, that I was too smart to get caught." He looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time. "I was wrong about everything, especially about you. You tried to destroy me," I said evenly. "You thought I was weak, that I'd accept whatever cruelty you inflicted because I had no other choice." "I know." His voice cracked slightly. "I underestimated you completely. And now I'm facing 30 years in prison because I believed my own lies more than I believed in basic decency." I felt no satisfaction in his broken state, no vindictive pleasure in watching him acknowledge his mistakes, just a quiet recognition that this man had once held enormous power over my life, and now held none. "Why did you want to see me?" I asked. "To apologize, and to tell you I'm glad you got out, that you fought back. If you hadn't—" He gestured vaguely at the room around us. "I'd probably still be out there, destroying more lives, believing I was untouchable." I stood, ready to leave. "I didn't do this to save you, Brandon. I did it to save myself." "I know," he said. "That's why it worked." As I walked out of the detention center into the afternoon sunlight, I felt the final weight lift from my shoulders. Brandon had been my last connection to a life I'd outgrown, a life where I'd been controlled, diminished, made to feel powerless. That woman no longer existed. I drove to the lakefront cabin, the windows down, music playing. The settlement money was invested wisely, generating returns that would sustain me for decades. The book manuscript was nearly finished. The fund for other women was growing. And most importantly, every decision I made, from how to spend my time to where to invest my money, was entirely my own. As sunset painted the lake in shades of orange and gold, I sat on the cabin's deck with a glass of wine, watching the water ripple in the evening breeze. Somewhere in a federal courtroom, Brandon's trial would begin in days. Lawyers would argue, evidence would be presented, justice would be served. But for me, the battle was over. I'd won not just a settlement or a courtroom victory, but something far more valuable: my freedom, my dignity, and the unshakable knowledge that I was capable of fighting for myself. The woman Brandon had tried to leave penniless and powerless had reclaimed everything he'd tried to take and had become someone stronger in the process. Not because of revenge or vindication, but because I'd learned the most important lesson of all: that true power doesn't come from controlling others, it comes from refusing to be controlled. As darkness settled over the lake, I raised my glass in a quiet toast to new beginnings, to hard-won freedom, and to the future I would write entirely on my own terms. The past was behind me. The woman I'd become was just getting started. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.